Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the oldest winter you can imagine before gods had names, before the first tree took root, before even the stars dared to glow, out there in the black nothing. A breath of fire slammed into a breath of ice, and something terrible, something enormous, opened its eyes. That's where Norse mythology begins. This isn't the bedtime story you grew up with. This is the kind of tale whispered in longhouses while snow sealed the doors shut, when men and women prayed the roof beams would hold another night. It's a story about hunger so deep it gave birth to giants, about betrayal carved into the bones of the universe, and about gods who were never safe, not even in their own halls. Imagine that emptiness, the yawning gap they called Ginnungagap, colder than death, hotter than guilt. Out of that void dripped a frost-rhymed giant, Ymir, and from his sweat crawled more giants. He wasn't even a villain. He was hunger given shape, a body of dripping ice and boiling steam. Every breath he took sent more giants crawling from his flesh, loud and clumsy, children of chaos, but chaos alone can't hold a story. Out of the frozen blocks came something gentler, stranger a great cow, Audumla, her hide glistening with frost, her tongue carving rivers in the salty ice. When she licked long enough, a shape began to form, first a hair, then a head, then the full body of a man. This was Buri, the ancestor of the gods, standing tall with a spark in his chest that Ymir would never understand. The gods who would come after him, Odin, Vili, and Ve, owed their very existence to a cow's patience and a giant's careless sweat. It's funny, isn't it? Norse mythology begins not with glory or lightning bolts, but with livestock and salt. Yet under that simplicity runs a sharp edge, because every creation story has a hidden threat. Ymir's children multiplied faster than the cold winds, and their strength filled the edges of the world. If they weren't stopped, there would be no room for anything else. No trees, no seas, no humans to tell bedtime stories by the fire. And so the young gods learned their first lesson sometimes: to create, you must destroy. They watched Ymir, bloated with power, his body feeding endless frost giants, and they made their choice. To give the world order, the first blood had to spill. The silence of Ginnungagap was about to be broken. Blood spilled, and the silence was shattered. Odin and his brothers struck with a fury born not from hatred, but from necessity. Ymir, the endless giant, bellowed as their blades cut through his frozen flesh. His cries echoed through Ginnungagap, rolling like thunder across an empty sky that didn't yet exist. When the giant finally collapsed, his blood poured out in floods so vast they drowned almost every one of his children. Only a few frost giants clung to jagged ice at the edge of the abyss, spared to carry their rage into the future. The brothers stood over Ymir's broken body and saw not a corpse, but raw material. They dragged him into the void, each step shaking the nothingness beneath them. His bones splintered beneath their hands and became mountains. His flesh they stretched wide, hammering it flat into the earth. His skull, heavy and thick, they lifted and set above as the sky, holding it in place with 4 pillars, one at each corner of the world. From his blood, oceans swelled, restless and dark, swallowing the gaps between land and bone. And what of his brains? They scattered them across the heavens, and from that scattering came clouds, white, drifting, thought made visible. It's grotesque, yes, but it's also striking. The Norse imagined that the very air above us is the residue of a giant's mind. To breathe was to inhale memory, chaos, and maybe even fragments of his forgotten dreams. In that new world, framed by skull and sea, the gods felt a stirring order clawing its way out of ruin. Yet even in this birth, shadows lingered. At the roots of creation, 3 great women appeared, the Norns. They sat by the well beneath the vast tree Yggdrasil, spinning and cutting threads, writing destinies with hands that never paused. Not even Odin, not even the highest of gods, could escape their weaving. Fate was the first law, older than thunder, harsher than ice. Yggdrasil rose as the axis of everything, its branches arching over 9 realms, its roots drinking from wells both pure and poisonous. From one root came wisdom, from another rot, from another death. Squirrels darted up and down the bark, carrying insults between a great eagle at the top and a serpent gnawing below. Even the cosmic tree was never at peace. It quivered with the same tension that filled every hall and battlefield the Norse would ever know. Odin watched the tree and understood that to rule was not to command, but to endure. He felt it in his chest that even gods were fragile threads knotted into something larger, and those threads could be cut at any moment. The Norns smiled, or maybe they didn't. It was hard to tell in the dark beneath the roots. So the new world was shaped seas restless with giant's blood, mountains sharp with his bones, clouds drifting with his thoughts, and the sky arched with his skull. And in the middle, the tree that held everything together, yet whispered that nothing, not even gods, would last forever. The new world wasn't quiet for long. No sooner had the tree stretched its branches than war rattled across the realms. The Aesir, proud gods of Asgard, lifted their spears against the Vanir, deities of fertility, sea, and wealth. What sparked it, some say mistrust, some say greed. Others whisper it began with the burning of a witch named Gulveig. She walked into their halls cloaked in gold, and when the Aesir struck her down, she burned. Not once, but 3 times. Each time, she rose again from the ashes, laughing at their fear. Her name meant gold drunk, and her survival was a curse proof that wealth corrupts and cannot be killed. The Vanir saw this violence and declared war. They weren't as many as the Aesir, but they were cunning. They tore down walls, toppled towers, sent their storms and spells across the land. For a time, it seemed neither side could win. The gods of sky and storm clashed with the gods of earth and sea, and the 9 realms shook with their fury. But endless war starves even the mighty. The Aesir bled, the Vanir tired, and both realized what the Norns already knew: no one escapes fate, and fate had written stalemate. So the 2 tribes agreed to peace, sealed not by handshakes, but by a strange ritual. Each side spit into a great vessel. Out of that spit, thick and glistening, they shaped a man. His name was Kvasir, born of truce, filled with wisdom. He wandered the worlds, answering any question, solving any riddle. His voice was clear, his judgment beyond bias, and yet wisdom invites envy. 2 dwarves, Fjalar and Gala, captured him, slit his throat, and drained his blood into a cauldron. They mixed it with honey, brewing a mead that gave poetry to whoever drank it. From truce to treasure, from spit to song, the cycle was brutally simple. The Aesir and Vanir traded hostages too. The Vanir gave Njord, god of the sea, and his children, Freyr and Freya. In return, the Aesir sent Hönir, a handsome figure meant to look wise, and Mimir, the true counsellor. But when Hönir sat among the Vanir, he floundered, making every decision by saying, "Ask Mimir." The Vanir saw the trick, grew furious, and cut off Mimir's head. They sent it back to Odin, who refused to let wisdom rot. He embalmed the head, whispered charms, and kept Mimir's lips speaking secrets from beyond death. Peace was written, but unease lingered. The Vanir were never quite trusted, the Aesir never quite forgiven. Still, the world needed both sky and soil, storm and seed. Njord brought calm seas, Freyr the fertile fields, Freya the mysteries of love and death. Yet behind every gift was the echo of war, a reminder that even among gods, peace is carved from blood and bound with spit. The gods feasted again, raising horns of mead, but none forgot the witch who rose from the flames, nor the head that still whispered in Odin's ear. It was a fragile truce, balanced on grudges that would never truly die. And somewhere deep beneath the roots, the Norns cut and tied threads with steady hands, already preparing the next twist in the story. Asgard was still new then, its walls not yet the gleaming fortress they would become. The gods longed for safety, but giants prowled outside, hungering for vengeance. One day, a stranger arrived at their gates, no ordinary builder, but a craftsman so skilled he promised to raise walls around all of Asgard in a single season. His price, though, was unthinkable. The sun, the moon, and Freya herself. The gods bristled. To give away their treasures for stone seemed madness, yet the builder's confidence gnawed at them. Could he really do it after long debate? Odin and the council struck a deal, but they added one condition meant to ensure his failure: he could not use help from any man. The builder only nodded and whistled for his horse. Out from the trees trotted Svadilfari, a stallion of impossible strength, muscles rippling, eyes bright as frost. With that beast, stones moved like feathers, walls climbed skyward day by day, and the gods grew uneasy. It was Loki who they turned to, as always, when trouble swelled. He had been the one to urge them into the bargain, swearing it was safe. Now, cornered by their fury, he faced the cost of his own trick. If the builder finished on time, Freya would be lost, and so would the light of sun and moon. So Loki devised another trick, this one far darker. As the builder and his horse worked through the night, Loki slipped into the forest, changing shape, bones warping, breath shifting, until he was no longer a god at all, but a mare in heat. He trotted into the clearing, tail high, whinnying sweet and wild. Svadilfari's head jerked up, desire blazing. He broke from his harness and chased, leaving the builder screaming, powerless to haul stones alone. For nights the chase went on, until the deadline passed. When the gods saw the walls unfinished, they seized their chance. Thor's hammer came down like a storm, shattering the builder's skull. The price was unpaid. Asgard was spared, and Loki returned. But not as he had left. Months later he stumbled back into the halls, weary, and at his side trotted a foal with 8 legs, grey and ghostly. Sleipnir, the swiftest steed ever known, born from trickery and shame. Odin claimed him, and the horse carried him across the 9 worlds, a constant reminder that even in victory the gods leaned on lies. The walls of Asgard stood stronger after that, but the story clung to them like smoke. Every stone was a warning bargains have teeth, and Loki's cleverness always cuts both ways. The gods had their walls, but walls alone don't keep out chaos. They needed weapons, charms, treasures, objects that could turn the tide when giants came thundering down from Jotunheim. And once again, it was Loki who stirred the pot, his mischief curling like smoke in the rafters of Asgard. He had picked a quarrel with Thor's wife, Sif, a goddess known for her golden hair. One night, while she slept, Loki crept close with a knife and sheared her locks clean. By morning, Sif's head gleamed bald, and Thor's rage shook the floorboards. His fist hovered inches from Loki's face when the trickster swore he would fix it, swore he would bring back hair more radiant than before. And to prove it, he dove headfirst into the smoky caves of the dwarves. The dwarves were master smiths, artisans who could coax wonders from metal as easily as others baked bread. Loki approached the sons of Ivaldi, promising them gold and praise if they could spin new hair for Sif. They set to work, hammering and smelting, weaving threads of pure gold that would root into her scalp and grow like living hair. Not stopping there, they forged a folding ship, Skidbladnir, that could sail any sea, yet fold small enough to fit in a pocket. They also made Gungnir, a spear that never missed its mark. Loki grinned, thinking he had saved his skin. But mischief never stops at enough. He taunted another pair of dwarves, Brocker and Sindri, claiming they could never match such brilliance. His wager was cruel if they failed. They owed their lives. If they succeeded, Loki would forfeit his head. The brothers set to work, sweat beading, sparks flying, while Loki buzzed around them in the shape of a fly. He bit Brocker's eyelid as they hammered, drawing blood, nearly blinding him. Still, the hammer struck true, and out of the forge came Draupnir, a ring that dripped new gold every 9th night, and Gullinbursti, a boar with bristles of light, faster than any horse through land or air. Last came the hammer Mjolnir. The forge glowed, the iron roared, and Loki stung again. Desperate. Brocker flinched for half a heartbeat, and the handle of the hammer came out shorter than it should have. Still, the gods judged the treasures, laying them out one by one, weighing their worth. Odin claimed Gungnir and Draupnir. Freya took the boar and the ship. Sif's hair shone once more, but Thor held Mjolnir. And though the handle was small, though it looked almost crude, it had a power that no weapon could rival. With one swing, it would crush giants. With one throw, it would always return. The gods laughed at Loki's near death, sparing his head but sewing his lips shut for a time as punishment. He wriggled free of it later, of course, but the lesson was carved deep into Asgard's memory. Perfection was never the price of survival. The hammer was flawed, its grip awkward, yet it became the very heart of the god's defense. Sometimes, the things we trust most are the ones born from mistakes, and in the shadows, the giants watched, knowing that the day would come when even Mjolnir's strike might not be enough. The gods had their weapons, their treasures, their walls, but still the world felt incomplete. A realm without people is just an echo chamber of power, and the gods knew it. One day, Odin, together with his brothers, walked along the shore where the waves scattered driftwood like bones from an ancient feast. The air smelled of salt and seaweed, cold and raw. There, lying side by side, were two pieces of wood, one ash, tall and pale, the other elm, shorter and sturdier. They weren't much to look at, but the gods saw something waiting, something more than dead timber. Odin bent first, breathing life into the shapes. His breath was heavy and warm, filling their hollow chests. Vili followed, giving them understanding, the spark of thought. They added form, hands to grasp, feet to stand, faces to mirror the world around them. When the work was done, two figures stirred. The ash became a man, called Ask. The elm became a woman, called Embla. Their eyes blinked open, frightened yet curious, like children seeing fire for the first time. It was a tender moment, almost fragile. These were not giants born from sweat, not gods stitched from gold and arrogance. These were human mortal, breakable, destined to suffer, but also capable of love, of courage, of building something beyond themselves. The gods placed them in Midgard, a middle realm encircled by Ymir's bones, protected but exposed, and in doing so, they set the stage for a story far larger than their own, because gods without worshippers are only voices in the wind. Yet even as Ask and Embla learned to breathe, to walk, to stumble through their new world, the threads of fate tightened. By the roots of Yggdrasil, the Norns watched, dipping their runed knives into the water of destiny. They carved patterns into bark and bone, writing futures with strokes that could not be undone. Their faces gave nothing away whether kindness or cruelty drove their hands. No one could tell, but their judgment was absolute. Every life, god or human, was a line in their tapestry, and every line ended sooner or later. Odin felt the weight of that truth more than any other. He wanted knowledge, not comfort. He wanted to see beyond the moment, to grasp the hidden runes of power that the Norns guarded so jealously, and so he chose pain. One night, he hung himself from Yggdrasil, the great tree, pierced through with a spear of his own making. No bread touched his lips, no water passed his tongue. For 9 long nights he dangled between life and death, swaying in the wind, his body broken, his spirit stretched thin. Ravens circled overhead, silent, waiting to see if he would fall. But Odin did not fall. On the 9th night, exhausted, bleeding, delirious, he peered into the void, and the void whispered back. The runes revealed themselves, shapes of raw truth carved in shadow and light. They seared into his mind, burning him awake. With them came secrets of binding and loosing, of healing and harming, of shaping fate itself. He returned to Asgard, trembling but alive, holding in his voice the weight of a new kind of power. Ask and Embla learned to kindle fire, to plant seeds, to raise families. Odin had paid in blood for wisdom, and humanity would reap its benefits and curses alike. The gods had created people, but in that act they also created responsibility. Mortals now walked beneath the tree, and their stories would tangle with the stories of gods, carried forward on the same fragile threads. And from that moment on, the gods knew they had bound themselves to mankind, for better or worse, until the end of all things. The night the hall filled with gold light and smoke, the gods gathered to celebrate. Long tables creaked under roasted meats. Bright mead foamed in horns, and the rafters glowed like low embers. It felt safe in there, almost human laughter rolling easy, shoulders unarmored, the hush of a good fire stitching everyone closer. Freya's necklace flashed when she turned her head. Thor's laugh, too big for the room, shook plates. Odin's one good eye tracked everything, while Mimir's embalmed head, rested near the high seat, seemed to listen the way old dogs do, still and alert. Outside, The night ran cold and starry. Inside, they were warm enough to forget most things, not all things. The door swung open with a clatter of the iron rings, and Loki stepped in like a draught. His smile was wrong too sharp, too thin. The chatter sagged, then quieted. It wasn't that he wasn't welcome. It's that Loki rarely arrived without a price tag dangling from his ankle, a bill the rest of them would end up paying. He looked wet with travel, wind-snarled and bright-eyed, the kind of awake you get after walking too far under a sky that refuses to blink. He paused, let the gaze of the room settle on him like snow on a dark coat, and then he grinned wider. "You started without me," he said. "How rude." He moved down the table, trailing the smell of cold air and horse. He poured himself mead without waiting for permission, then drank as if thirst could be humiliated. The first swallow cut a heat line across his throat. The second made his shoulders drop a notch. The third turned the edges of his mouth soft, briefly, almost tender. Then he tapped the horn against the table and said, "Let's tell the truth tonight. No one invited that. No one wanted it. Truth is a stupid thing to pour on a feast. It soaks the bread, ruins the meat, makes even the sweetest mead taste bitter." But Loki had already started, and once he started, the only way out was through. He turned to Freya first, because he always chose beauty when he wanted to draw blood. "You, with your jewels and your smile like a knife hidden under silk. How many halls have you warmed this winter? How many men did you leave counting their ribs like beads because you took the breath right out of them?" His voice wasn't cruel exactly. It was worse. It was clinical. Freya held his stare with a calm that made the room exhale. "If I warm halls," she said, "it is because this world is cold." She lifted her horn and drank. The gold at her throat glowed like a small sun. For a heartbeat, Loki looked almost ashamed. He moved on. "Odin," he said lightly, as if saying a friend's name in the market. "You who traded an eye for a sip and then claimed to see more than the rest of us. You who hang from trees for knowledge, who whisper to dead men, who keep a talking head for counsel. Do you remember that the first lie told in this hall was yours, that you promised one thing, took another, and called it wisdom? How many oaths have you twisted into rope, old man?" A muscle in Odin's jaw tightened. The blink of the empty socket looked like a storm shutter trying not to rattle. He didn't answer. You don't argue with a knife while it's mid-swing. Loki leaned, lazy, toward Tyr. "How's the hand?" he asked, too brightly. Tyr's shoulders stiffened. His sleeve hung empty where his right hand should have been. The skin pulled tight over the scar at the wrist tribute to Fenrir, who trusted one oath too many, Tyr said, evenly. It hurts less when people stop pretending it was worth it. And just like that, the hall was colder. Loki grinned again, but now it looked like strain. "You want me to stop?" he asked, head tipped, voice gentler. "I can stop. We can drink and hum and pretend. We can ignore the draft under the door and the way the rafters creak, and how every oath we make burns like frostbite when it comes time to pay. No one sent him away, not even Thor." The hammer rested at Thor's side, its short handle dark and nicked from 1,000 bad days, the weapon of a god who had learned to live with imperfection. Thor watched Loki as if watching bad weather knowing it would pass, but also knowing roofs sometimes go with it. Loki turned again, like a tide changing its mind. "Heimdall," he called up the table, "you stand at the edge of everything, listening to the world with those ears of yours. Tell me, gatekeeper, after 1,000 years of hearing hoofbeats and tears and excuses, did you forget what music sounds like?" Heimdall's mouth twitched, almost a smile, almost a snarl. "I hear the difference between truth and noise," he said. "You've always been louder than both." A few chuckles rolled weakly down the benches. Loki caught one of them like a ball and tossed it back as laughter, but it died in the air between his hands. He looked down the table to where Sif sat, hair a brilliant river of gold that fell over her shoulders like wheat. For a heartbeat, he was quiet, remembering the night he took that hair away, the way Thor's breath smelled like lightning when he promised to break Loki's bones one by one. "You're welcome," Loki said softly to Sif, nodding at the golden flood. She looked at him with a tired mercy he didn't deserve. He drank again. The mead was sweet but honest, a dangerous combination. "Let's not pretend," Loki said. "Warm now. Word sliding. Let's say it, we are a family of bargains. We trade eyes for sips, hands for peace, walls for mares, oaths for a few more weeks of quiet. We are the cold people holding a little fire and telling ourselves it will last. A log in the hearth popped, sending up a brief blur of sparks. Everyone's eyes flicked there, grateful for something simple to look at. Mimir's head looked almost amused. If wisdom survives after death, maybe laughter does too. Maybe the dead find us delightful when we lie. Freya set her horn down and folded her hands. What is it you want, Loki? The gentleness in her voice was a gift, one of those gifts that come wrapped in a dare. If this is your truth night, say it. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, throat working. For a glinting second, you could see the man under the mask, lonely as winter, tired as a road with no town on it. Then it was gone. I want, he said, for all of you to admit you need me. That your neat little order runs on my chaos like a mill on water. You lock your doors, and I come back with keys. You build your walls, and I come back with a horse that runs through the sky. You lose your hammer, and I dress you in a veil and send you to your wedding. Thor's teeth showed. Say my name one more time and I'll teach your ribs how to count, he said. Not loud, not quiet. A promise all the way through. Loki didn't look at the hammer. He knew what it could do. He also knew it had failed before, just for a second. In a dwarven forge he'd crowded with bad luck and a fly's bite. Imperfect tools, perfect consequences. Odin raised his hand, a small motion that moved the whole room back into place. Enough for tonight, he said. His voice was patient, like the sea pretending it's calm. We can drink and be torn apart another night. But Loki wasn't finished. Some people need to touch the stove twice. He circled the end of the table toward Bragi, the god of poetry, whose hair lay like quiet on his shoulders. And you, Loki said almost kindly, you who sing the mead sweet, you who call cowardice by softer names. Tell them what the dwarves did to make your voice so pretty. Tell them what your poems are mixed with. Blood. Right. The good stuff always starts in a wound. Bragi's eyes slid to the horn in his hands. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Everyone knew the story, Kvasir. Born from truce, killed by envy, bled into a pot, honeyed into inspiration, stolen by Odin in the shape of an eagle. The best lies wear a feathered coat until they pass for migration. The air inside the hall turned dense and slow. It felt like snow before a storm, pressing low enough to make your ears ring. Loki looked around at all that power, the spears and jewels and smiles and scars, and there was a tremble in him, like a string drawn too tight. He had come for heat, and it had warmed him. He'd come for truth, and it had stripped him down to bone. Toast me, he said suddenly, bright again, desperate. Toast the man who keeps you honest, who speaks the things you swallow. He lifted his horn high, waiting. No one moved. The silence was clean, final. Even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Heimdall stood first, not for Loki, but for the door. He walked to it with unshowy grace, opened it to the night, and let the cold lay a hand over the feast. The stars looked very far away. You could feel the pitch of the world below them, the slow turning that never asked for a blessing and never gave one. The watch resumes, Heimdall said simply, and stepped outside. The spell broke. People shifted, exhaled. Thor's hand drummed once against the hammerhead and stilled. Freya leaned to speak to her brother, a soft murmur like velvet being folded. Odin angled his head toward Mimir's lips. Somewhere, a serving girl refilled a pitcher with the gentlest clink. Life returned to the hall like blood creeping back into a numbed hand. Loki set his horn down, quiet as a prayer, then picked it up again. He looked like a man who had just realized the bridge he burned was the only one in town. He pulled his cloak around his shoulders and turned toward the door. No one stopped him. No one offered a word. He walked into the night that always welcomed him because it welcomed everyone, even the worst of us. Outside, the sky felt honest. He breathed it like a man who'd been underwater too long. He wanted to say he didn't care. He wanted to say they were fools. He wanted to say he'd save them again and then charge triple. Instead, he stood still and listened to the thin sound of winter travelling through pine needles. His anger cooled a few degrees. He remembered a foal with 8 legs and a laugh he hadn't meant to love. He remembered promises that tasted like iron and lilted like lullabies. Behind him, The feast picked up, softer now, careful. Inside warmth, they practiced forgetting. Loki practiced remembering. Both were hard work. Both would fail. He walked the ridge above the hall, boots grinding frost. The world lay neat for once, the black ribs of the mountains, the silver line of the river, the dim haze where Midgard slept, little fires arranged like constellations that finally learned how to sit down. Somewhere far off. A wolf lifted its voice and let it fall. He heard the echo as a prediction no one wanted to hear. He touched the scar at his lip where dwarves had hurriedly sewn it shut once, dark thread, clumsy needle, punishment dressed as craft. He smiled a little, and the smile hurt the way old jokes hurt. "You're welcome," he told the sleeping world, and the world did not answer, which felt correct. When he came down again, the hall had thinned. Gods slipped to their chambers. The fire deepened from orange to the low red you can listen to without thinking. Odin was still there, hand on Mimir's head, eyes far, maybe farther than the roof, farther than the sky, into rooms where tomorrow already sat with its arms crossed. Loki stepped inside and paused. The door fell shut with a sigh. Odin didn't look up. He didn't need to. "You were right about one thing," he said. The old god's voice had sand in it. "We do need you. We need you like a wound needs salt. It stings. It keeps us from rotting." Loki stood very still, then laughed once. Softly. "Real. Careful," he said. "Say enough nice things and they'll think you like me." Odin finally met his eyes. Whatever warmth the mead had offered was gone. "I didn't say that," he said. "Go home." Loki. Loki nodded. He swallowed whatever else wanted to come up. He turned and left a second time, because sometimes you have to keep leaving until you figure out what you're trying to get away from. The night took him in without a question. The snow started, thin and fine. Each flake landed and stayed, building a world that looked new in the morning even though it was the same old world with a fresh lie. Up in the dark, a raven shifted on a beam, black on black. Another answered from outside. They were Odin's, but they were also themselves, hungry and unbothered. They'd fly at dawn and find what needed finding, a lost path, a dead truth, a rumour with teeth. Inside the hall, Tyr tightened the knot on his empty sleeve and stared at the door. Freya brushed hair from her shoulder and looked into the middle distance the way people do when they're in two places at once. Thor slept in a chair, chin on chest, one hand on the hammer like a child with a favourite toy, like a soldier with a last chance. The fire lowered again, then again, until it became the kind of glow that makes even gods blink slow. No one said it out loud, but everyone felt it. The feast had ended in the way winter always ends a day, not with a door slammed, but with heat stepping back. Somewhere under the roots, the Norns whet their knives. They didn't write jokes. They didn't write apologies. They cut and tied. The threads they touched tonight felt rougher than usual. Maybe it was the cold. Maybe it was the way certain words, once spoken, keep echoing long after the speaker is gone. And the world turned, steady and indifferent, as if to say you can roast each other all you like. Darlings. The bill is already on the table. Dawn came slow, a grey ribbon unspooling across the horizon. Thor woke with the kind of heaviness that meant he'd slept too hard. Neck kinked, mouth dry. Dreams full of snow and iron. He reached for the comfort that always lived within arm's length, the cool weight of his hammer. His fingers closed on empty furs. He sat up. The breath left his chest in a blunt, ugly sound. He pawed the bed, the floor, beneath the bench. Nothing. The space beside him felt like a missing tooth, tongue prodding and finding pain. He stood so fast the stool went over with a clap. Sif startled, hair sliding golden across her shoulder like a soft warning. "What is it?" "My hammer," he said, and the room seemed to narrow to a thin hallway with no doors. "Mjolnir, it's gone. There's a silence that happens when you lose something you're not supposed to lose: your keys, your temper, your father." The mind starts sprinting nowhere. Thor bolted for the doors, boots punching the floor. The morning air bit him clean. He scanned the yard, the racks, the pegs where gear slept like tamed storms. No hammer, not propped, not hidden, not anywhere. A cold he didn't recognize slid under his skin. He turned and shouted a name he never loved to need. Loki. The trickster arrived as if the sound had summoned him out of the seam between light and shade. He looked at Thor's face, then at the hammer-shaped absence that kept dragging the eye, and did not smile. "Well," he said lightly, which in Loki's mouth meant he was watching the floor beneath them for cracks. "That's news. Find it," Thor said. It wasn't a request, but it also wasn't a threat. It was the rope you throw to the person on the riverbank because you're already in the water. Loki's tongue clicked against his teeth, thinking. "There's a way to travel faster than panic," he said, and went to Freya's hall to borrow the feather cloak skin that hummed with flight. Freya was up with the dawn, beads of brisingamen cool against her throat, eyes sharp. She listened, and something hard and protective kindled in her gaze. She handed over the cloak with no ceremony, only a warning that tasted like steel. "Bring it back. Bring the hammer back." Loki nodded, and for once there wasn't even a joke to blunt the edge. He threw the feathers around his shoulders, and the world lifted. Air caught him, clever and cold, and the ground became a quilt of grey and white. He flew over the rippling skin of seas, over the jagged teeth of mountains, toward the bruised dark line of Jotunheim. The winds there carry a different smell-wet stone. Old bones, a sweetness that's almost rot. He folded down into a valley chewed out by ice, and found a hall big enough to be mistaken for geography. On a throne, built more like a cliff than furniture, sat Thrym, a giant with hands like shovels and a beard that broke the light into coarse shadow. He saw the hawk settle, saw it turn itself into a man with quick, clever hands, and he grinned like someone who had just found the missing piece in a game he was winning. Looking for something, Thrym boomed. "I came for the weather," Loki said with a little bow, "but rumours travel faster. They say a hammer fell from the sky and did not bounce back." Thrym laughed. It sounded like rocks deciding to move. "Tell the Thunderer," he said, and his eyes shone with the greedy brightness of a man who's sure he finally owns the thing he's feared. "Tell Thor I have his toy. I buried it 8 miles under the earth where no hand can reach, and I will not give it back unless he sends me Freya as my wife. With her necklace and her pride. I want the sun on my arm, the moon in my bed." Loki measured the distance between the giant's jaw and his temper. "You ask for a lot," he said, "but I've seen worse bargains made over weaker ale." He bowed again, feathers whispering, and rose into the hard air. Back in Asgard, he landed on the wide stone still warm from daylight. Thor waited, chest rolling, eyes dark with that particular fear that turns the strongest among us into boys for a moment. "Well, he has it," Loki said. "He buried it deep. He'll trade the hammer for Freya in a wedding veil." He glanced toward her hall. He wants more than jewellery. The slam of Thor's breath could have put out a candle across the room. Freya arrived like the weather turning sudden, decisive. Loki told her the demand. The heat in her cheeks was a sunrise no one wanted to be near. "I will not be hauled to a giant's bed like cargo," she said, voice so flat and steady it was almost gentle. "I will not be bartered for a weapon. I don't care if it's the last weapon we have." Odin gathered the council, helmets and hair, scars and crowns. The room stank of old wars and newer pride. They argued, and the arguments were centuries old. We can't. We must. There's another way. There isn't. In the end, the only idea that didn't taste like defeat came from a place that always smells faintly of humiliation. Loki's smile was small and mean. "The kind you wear when you've solved a riddle you hate. Dress him as a bride," he said, and let the words sit like a fish on the table. "Veil him. Load him with jewels. Give him Freya's necklace. We'll say he hasn't eaten in days because he's so excited. We'll say the fire in his eyes is love and not lightning. We'll go to the wedding and take the hammer when they bring it out to bless the union. We'll do what we always do, cheat better." For a long breath, no one spoke. Thor's face walked through a lot of rooms, shock, anger, mortification, reluctant comprehension. He swallowed, and the swallow was loud. "If this works," he said, "I'll carry the shame. If it doesn't, I'll carry the haul." Freya unclasped Brisingamen and stepped forward. The necklace lay heavy, warm from her skin. She draped it over Thor's collarbones with a care that made the gesture feel like more than a costume. "We do what keeps us alive," she said. "You will not go alone in this." They dressed him as a bride, a veil as white as a lie, keys at the belt symbols of the house, and all it held clinked against his thigh. Bracelets chimed at his wrists. They lined his eyes with coal till they looked deeper, darker, like the sea under a moon. Thor endured it in silence, jaw set, muscles bunching under fabric that had never held anything like him. Loki stood beside him in maid's garb, transformed with the ease of someone who never lets a single form keep him. He smiled at Thor, not unkind. "Try not to crush anyone's hand," he said. "Brides who break fingers raise suspicions." They set out for Jotunheim in a sleigh that hissed over snow, runners singing their thin metallic song. The sky was a lid of pewter. Frost grew beards on the trees. The wind had teeth and used them. Thor sat with the patience of a stone under a stream. Loki, beside him, kept up a light flow of remarks, most of them designed to keep Thor from imagining how this would go wrong. "Remember," Loki said, "when they bring food, you sip. When they bring mead, you taste. When they praise your beauty, you nod as if you've heard it before and been terribly bored by it." They arrived at Thrym's hall to the kind of welcome given to dangerous gifts. Banners hung stiff in the cold, torches spiked the dusk with wavering light. Thrym strode out to meet them, beard braided with bits of iron and bone. He looked at the veiled figure and went soft in the face in the way men do when they believe their desire is about to be sanctified by ceremony. "Freya," he said, and the word dripped. "Finally." Thor lowered his head, the veil nodding. Loki curtsied, lips tucked against a laugh that wanted out. They were led inside. The hall smelled of roasted meat, wet wool, and the faint copper of old blood in the cracks of the floor. Thrym boasted as hosts do when they want to distract you from what they fear. He spoke of his wealth, his herds, the mountain he'd hollowed into rooms, the hammer he'd pinned under the earth like a snake beneath a rock. He spoke to fill space and keep doubt at bay. They sat. The feast began. This was the moment the plan was supposed to float like a swan, serene, effortless, a miracle of balance hiding frantic feet. Servants brought platters heavy enough to bend wrists. Thor's stomach, which had never believed in small meals, woke up like a bear in spring. He swallowed once and tried to sip politely. The first bite was supposed to be delicate, ornamental, a nod to the performance. The first bite turned into a second, then a third, then a steady rhythm of hunger and relief. He ate an entire ox. He ate 8 salmon as if they'd wronged him. He drank horn after horn of mead, the sweet foam shining on the veil's edge. Thrym stared, awe and suspicion wrestling in his eyes. "Freya," he said carefully, "hasn't eaten like this at my table before." Loki leaned in, voice smooth. "She hasn't eaten in 8 nights, he said, hand at his mouth as if confiding something delicate. "Not a crumb. She was so excited to marry you she forgot how food works." He smiled sweetly enough to rot teeth. Thrym brightened, pleased to be the sort of man who inspires fasting. Thrym tried to steal a glance under the veil. Thor felt the flick of that gaze like a gnat he wanted to crush. His eyes, which could be kind when the world let him be, burned like forges. He forgot to look shy. He looked ready and Thrym flinched. "Her eyes," he murmured. "They flash like embers. That's new. 8 nights without sleep thinking of you," Loki said without missing a step. "Fire does that to a woman." The hall laughed, relieved to have a reason. Thor clenched the armrest so hard the wood creaked. Loki slid a hand onto his wrist under the table, quick pressure. A coded plea hold. They called for the marriage rite. The hall shifted into that ceremonial quiet that can feel like the top of a cliff. Thrym's sister brought the wedding linen, the old cloth richer with oil and smoke than with pattern. Thrym stood, wide and proud, raising his hands for silence. "Bring forth the hammer to bless the bride," he ordered, voice thick with triumph. "Lay Mjolnir on her lap, as custom demands, that our union be sealed with power." For a heartbeat, the world gave itself away. Thor's breath came sharp. Loki's pulse raced in his throat. Somewhere far off, a raven lifted its head. The giants went to the earth door and hauled up the thing buried under all that weight. When Mjolnir crossed the threshold, it felt like weather changing. The air got that clean. Restless clarity storms have right before they decide which way to go. The hammer looked smaller than the moment deserved. Handle stubby, head nicked and blunt, a tool that shouldn't have been enough for anything. They brought it to the bride and set it on her lap. Thor didn't move at first. He let the weight settle into the familiar groove above his knees, the place that remembered. Then he closed his hands around it, veil trembling, and the hall tasted the truth too late. He tore the veil back. The room saw what it should have seen all along the jaw like a cliff, the eyes like weather, the smile that meant something awful had just become inevitable. Everything that followed happened with the simplicity of an axe falling. He stood. He swung. Thrym's crown split with a sound that made the torches shiver. He turned and struck again. The hammer's return, a faithful line of light through the dim. Giants surged up from the benches too slow, too mortal. The hammer found ribs, knees, teeth, the thick cords of necks. Wood cracked. Bone cracked louder. Loki moved like a smoke knife through gaps, tripping, blinding, turning chairs into obstacles, stools into traps. Thor drove forward the way rivers do when the thaw comes and nothing in their path is strong enough to be called a shore. It was not a battle, it was the end of a sentence. Thrym fell across his own table, spilling meat into ash. His sister tried to lift a pike. Loki kicked her ankle sideways and she dropped with a howl. The servants fled. The hall filled with the heavy smell of iron and the lighter smell of fear. Always braided, always the same. When it was done, Thor stood among the wreckage, breath hauling, the hammer steady in his hand as if it had never left. Loki straightened his tattered maid's dress and looked at Thor with a face that, for a blink, held affection unguarded. "You did try to sip," he said, which almost counted as praise. Thor snorted, half laugh, half leftover rage. They did not bury anyone. They did not speak apologies over the dead. That wasn't the custom here. And anyway, the snow would do its work. Outside, the sky had gone the pale colour it takes on before it turns blue again. They stepped into it as men who had just returned from a humiliation too useful to regret. On the way back, neither spoke much. The sleigh hissed. The cold worked tiny knives along their cheeks. Loki finally pulled the veil from Thor's shoulder and folded it neatly, as if respecting the cloth could retroactively honour the lie. "You carried this well," he said. Thor shrugged. "We do what keeps us alive." He glanced sideways. "I don't like needing you." Loki's mouth tilted. "I know," he said. "I don't like being needed." Asgard received them with that particular relief people feel when the thing they were all pretending not to worry about walks in the door intact. Sif met Thor on the steps, touched the hammer, then his face, then his shoulder, a sequence like a spell. Freya reclaimed her necklace with a smile that had teeth for anyone who tried such bargaining again. Odin's eye took them both in the blood on Thor's sleeve, the faint smear of coal at his temple. The veil draped over Loki's arm and what might have been amusement ghosted his mouth before seriousness snapped it shut. "Good," he said simply. "We can postpone the world ending until after lunch." That night, when the hall had quieted and the kind of peace that is really just exhaustion settled over the beams, Thor sat alone with the hammer across his lap. He turned it in his hands the way people handle old photographs, careful, reverent, half afraid of what they'll remember. He thought about the way Thrym had said Freya's name, like a man trying to buy a season. He thought about the weight of the veil on his head, the twin humiliations of disguise and necessity. He thought, and this surprised him, about the laughter that had bubbled up in his chest when the first giant's jaw had dropped at the sight of him unmasked. It felt good to surprise the world. It felt better to get the world back into the shape it understood. Loki sat on the edge of the dais, swinging his feet like a child trying not to think about bedtime. "They'll tell this as a funny story," he said, voice soft and a little tired. "A joke with a body count. They'll polish it until it fits between 2 sips of mead. They'll forget the part where you had to decide what your pride was worth." Thor looked up, something like gratitude moving quietly through his ribs. "Maybe that's fine," he said. "Maybe the world needs funny endings sometimes." "Until it doesn't," Loki said. And his eyes flicked toward the far dark where wolves grow out of shadows and prophecies chew on doors. He pushed off the dais and stood. "Sleep. I'll go put the cloak back before Freya decides I look better in feathers," Thor chuckled. "You don't?" "I absolutely do," Loki said, but the jest lay gently between them. No barbs, no teeth. He left with the brisk steps of a man who intends to outrun something he knows he can't. Thor stayed. He listened to the hall breathe, to the wind work the eaves, to the faint far-off rush of a river still carrying snowmelt from mountains no one had named. He rested the hammer against his shoulder, closed his eyes, and let the heaviness of the day turn into the softer weight that precedes sleep. He wasn't innocent and never had been, but he was simple in a way that felt clean problem, response, consequence, and whatever came after, tonight the problem had been solved. Consequences could wait until morning, elsewhere, under roots that never stopped drinking. 3 women dipped their knives. The thread that had held the day together lay across their laps, coarse, a little singed in places, but intact. One of them smiled, or maybe it was just a tightening around the eyes that meant nothing. They don't say why they cut where they cut. They don't apologize when they tie 2 lines together that never wanted to meet. They only work. The story would be told and told again how a god wore a veil, how a hammer found its way home, how laughter and blood are cousins. People would fall asleep to it, the way they do with truths they can't swallow all at once. In the morning, they'd wake to chores and cold and the same old questions with the same old answers. That, too, is a kind of blessing. The world stays itself for one more day, and far away, under 8 miles of earth, in a hollow Thrym had thought very clever. There was suddenly nothing where a hammer had been. The absence had its own gravity, a little sinkhole in the map. Things fall into absences if you leave them long enough. It's a law as old as appetite. By the time the sky blued up and the ravens lifted like thought, Asgard was already resetting its bones. The walls stood, the fires went down, then up. Someone mended a crack in a bench with a wedge of scrap oak. Someone else laughed at a joke and meant it. The gods moved through their mourning as if it would last forever, which is the only way to move through any mourning. The hammer lay where it belonged, flawed and perfect, asleep as a stone until the world needed waking again. The morning after the veil and the hammer and the slaughtered feast. A heaviness moved through the halls that had nothing to do with tired bones. It was the kind of weight you feel when a joke lands too close to the truth. Odin went walking before the others woke, down to the terraces where frost lifts off the grass like breath. He stood there a long time, eye on a horizon that was pretending to be harmless. Ravens circled, and somewhere in the distance a wolf sang like metal bowed against stone. News travelled with the kind of speed only bad news knows. It came from the far east edge of the forest, where trees grow taller than patience and light is a rumour. A hunt had spied a woman you never meet by accident, Angerbod, a bringer of sorrow, standing amid trunks black with old weather, her hair a tangle of night, her smile a cut across silence. She was cradling something against her chest like a secret. By the time the story reached the high seat, it had sprouted antlers and fangs and prophecies, the way stories do when they're trying to warn you and brag at the same time. Odin didn't need the flourishes. He knew the name, knew the shape of the trouble that walked with it. He called for Loki. They faced each other the way men do when they have run out of excuses and are about to use the truth like a dull knife. "She's yours," Odin said. Not a question. Loki's mouth twitched into something that could have been a smile if it had been fed better. "Some things," Loki said, "are ours only until the world notices. Bring them," Odin said. "All of them." The forest made a corridor for Loki because the forest is practical and wants things done. He went alone. He found Angerboda where the rumour placed her, and he didn't pretend surprise. 2 people who have loved each other against good judgment do not waste time acting. They spoke the way a blade speaks to a whetstone, gently, without illusions. She did not ask him for protection. He did not ask her to run. 3, she said, and her voice was a leaf turning over in a slow current. 3 children. None of them asked for this. None of us did. He thought of all the things he might say to make it easier, and then didn't say them because lies are sugar you lick off a knife. "I will carry what I can," he said. She nodded, and it was both permission and thanksgiving and grief. The first child was a wolf, huge even for his day, paws already broad enough to leave prints that looked like small lakes after rain. He stared at Loki with yellow eyes that held too much future in them. The second was a serpent, black-green and slick, its body coiling and uncoiling as if it were practicing eternity. The third was a girl, her face almost ordinary, almost lovely, but her skin was the colour of winter in some places, and the colour of bruised night in others, as if she'd been stitched together from opposite sides of a sky. Loki brought them back through the trees in a silence that buzzed with birds and the small machinery of insects. When he crossed the threshold, Asgard did what people do when presented with the shape of their fear. They stared and worked hard not to stare. The wolf padded beside Loki with impatient dignity. The serpent rode across his shoulders like a length of living rope. The girl walked, quiet as weather coming in. Odin listened to Mimir's emboldened lips and heard what he already knew, that these children were teeth built for prophecy. That if the world had an ending, they would be there when the fire was tall enough. That there would be a day when a god's chest would vanish in a wolf's mouth, and a day when a thunderer would kill a serpent and take 9 steps before falling into a sleep no one wakes from. Prophecy is a rude guest. It sits down without waiting to be asked and puts its elbows on the table. The council came together like stones around a fire. They argued. They were good at that. The arguments sounded like old songs because they were, mercy is a luxury for people with extra time. The gods didn't feel like they had any. They did what frightened people do when they can't afford to lie to themselves. They separated the problem into pieces and labelled each piece as gently as a blade allows. The serpent they took to a cliff where the sea begins its long, slow letter to the land. Odin looked at Loki once. Loki didn't flinch. They cast the serpent in. He hit the water like a sentence hitting the end of the page and kept going, down and down and down, until even gods stopped claiming they know what's there. He grew while he fell. He grew when he landed. He learned the circumference of the world the way a hand learns a wrist. He wrapped it once and found it pleasant. He wrapped it again and found it inevitable. If you listen right on bad nights, you can hear the ocean breathe with him. The girl they sent beneath the roots. Hell. They gave her a realm named with her name because sometimes we bless and wound with the same gesture. She took the hall with a grace that made the hair lift on the back of the neck. She sat on a throne of what came before and what will come after and opened her arms to those who died of sickness, of old age, of the slow undoing. She was not cruel. That made it worse. She was thorough. She did not lie to parents, to lovers, to children. She supervised endings with the patience of a tide that knows the moon will come back. Loki watched her go with a face he didn't show anyone else, a face that learned how to break in silence. The wolf they kept. The gods told themselves a story about that decision, because gods are the kind of people who know the power of a good story. They told themselves they could raise him into love. They told themselves that if they fed him from their own bowls, if they taught him to lie beside the fire, if they let him smell their hair and memorize their voices and sleep with his spine against the stone of the hall, he would learn what family feels like and choose to be less than prophecy required. They were not stupid. They were just trying to see if hope would let them cheat. They named him Fenrir. He learned their names as well as they learned his. He was awkward and large, the way teenagers are awkward and large. The way spring rivers are awkward and large when they're not yet sure where the bank will hold. He ran with the young, his joy immense and embarrassing. He toppled benches and apologized with his eyes. He loved rough play and hated being left out. He grew. There are days when the gods are almost human. They fed Fenrir tidbits from the table, the way you do when you forget that what you're feeding is hunger. He'd lay his head in Tyr's lap and pretend to sleep while Tyr's good hand drifted behind one ear and the other arm. The empty one rested across the wolf's ribs, feeling each breath like a tide. Tyr told him stories in a low voice about battle and laughter and the way bravery tastes like iron and honey. Fenrir's tail thumped, slow and huge. Thor would wrestle him in the yard, laughing the kind of laugh that makes children proud, and Fenrir would try very hard not to use all his strength. Sif would scold with a smile when he knocked over a bench and then sneak him scraps later with the same hands. Freya would scratch his chest while he stared at her with a devotion that made even hardness feel a little soft. He kept growing. You can't pet prophecy small. Soon even Thor said enough and meant it. The wolf's paws were pans, his tongue a wet flag. When he yawned, the room saw the red of a heart beating past his teeth. Him curled by the fire looked like a hallway suddenly built where there hadn't been one. Odin watched, and the watching carved another line into his face. He went to the dwarves, because dwarves are where you go when you need an answer that hurts. The first chain they made was called lading. It was thick, honest iron. The kind of chain you use when you want everyone to believe you're doing something sensible. They brought it to the yard in bright daylight. Fenrir looked at it as a boy looks at a dare. The gods grinned like older cousins. "Let's play," they said. "Let's see if you can break it." He let them wind it round his legs, his chest. He lay on his side with the patience of someone who loves attention. Then he stood. Muscles bunched, paws bit the dirt, and lading sang a note like a harp string and went to pieces. Dust rose. The gods laughed too loudly. Fenrir's tail wagged like a banner at the wrong parade. They came back a week later with Dromi, twice as strong and 4 times less honest. Thick links, impossible welds, a confidence that smells like desperation. Fenrir watched them with bright interest. Like a student learning a trick, he let them loop it. He let them pull it tight. He flexed once, twice, tested the give, and then he let the low growl come up from his chest the way thunder comes up out of the ground. The chain groaned, begged, snapped. A piece spun past Bragi's ear and cut his song. The laughter this time sounded like glass. The yard changed that day. People avoided it without saying they were avoiding it. Work got done in other places. Doors closed quicker. Children were called inside a few breaths sooner. Fenrir felt it like a draft. He whined and tried very hard to be small, which is the saddest kind of trying. Odin did not sleep that night. He walked the perimeter of the wall Loki had once lured a horse away from building. He felt very old in the particular way you feel old when you know you're about to do something that will break your furniture and your heart. At dawn, he left Asgard and went where the world keeps its secrets to Svartalfheim, with its forges and its men who never see the sun unless they're laughing at it. He asked for a chain that wasn't a chain. He asked for a solution that would embarrass strength. The dwarves listened the way carpenters listen to a floor that squeaks, already measuring where to place the nail. They used no metal anyone had a name for. They took what the world insists does not exist: the footfall of a cat, the beard of a woman, the roots of a mountain, the sinews of a bear, the breath of a fish, the spittle of a bird. They braided the impossible into a ribbon soft as regret, smooth as new skin, pink like something still alive. They called it Gleipnir. It weighed almost nothing. It weighed everything. The gods carried it back like a lie you hope is kind enough to forgive you later. They found Fenrir in the yard, his ears up, his heart doing that too human thud when people you love walk toward you using their gentle voices. A game, Thor said, and the voice he used on the wolf was the same voice he used for children and storms he was trying to talk out of their worst ideas. One more. Not iron this time. A ribbon. If you can snap it. We'll stop asking. Fenrir looked at the ribbon, and then at their faces. He saw fear tidy as a freshly made bed. He sat, the giant body arranging itself with unexpected grace. His tail thumped once, less sure than it used to. "I will not be bound with magic without a promise," he said, clear, careful words that reached everyone across the yard and landed heaviness on the shoulders they touched. "One of you must place a hand in my mouth while you tie it. If this is trickery, I will keep the hand. If it's not, you lose nothing." The gods glanced at each other and found what they found, which was mostly their own shoes. Oaths are delicious until the bill comes. The yard went quiet, the way rooms do when no one wants to step forward and everyone is waiting for someone to be noble on their behalf. Tyr moved. Of course it was Tyr. The god who had fed Fenrir treats and scratched him behind the ears and told him stories that didn't pretend bravery didn't hurt. He stepped up without theatre. He held out his right hand as if offering a toy. Fenrir's eyes went wide with a sadness that broke the air into crystals. "Do you trust them?" he asked. "I trust you," Tyr said, and slipped his hand between those big teeth, palm up, as if he were reading the wolf's future. The world held still. The ribbon slid around Fenrir's forelegs, his chest, his neck. It lay against fur like a promise you can hardly feel. "Now," someone whispered, and Thor pulled, and the dwarven ribbon woke. It did not tighten with metal's cruelty. It cinched the way fate cinches without sound, without mercy, without anything for you to grab hold of to say wait. Fenrir lunged once, twice, the ground tearing under his nails, the yard suddenly a painting of frantic motion. He came up short every time, the ribbon drinking his power like sand drinks water. The gods stepped back like men watching a flood from roofs they're not sure will hold. Fenrir stilled. He felt the truth. He flexed his jaw to free Tyr's hand and found the ribbon did not allow it. He stopped again and breathed very carefully, his mouth full of someone who had always told him the truth. Tyr met his eyes and did not look away. The gods who couldn't find their courage earlier found it now that it was useless. "You lied," Fenrir said, and it was not a roar. It was worse. It was disappointment made into a sound. "We promised survival," Odin said, and if there was apology in it, it was the kind that arrives too late to deserve the name. Tyr nodded once. "Do it," he said, and before anyone could think they were gentler than they were. Fenrir bit down. There are noises we don't talk about. This was one. Tyr didn't scream. The Yard did. Blood stalled in Fenrir's mouth like a decision. Tyr pulled what was left of his arm away and stood pale as theology, his jaw tight, eyes bright with something that wasn't quite tears and wasn't far. He swayed. Thor reached him first, the big hands suddenly careful. Freya wrapped a cloth tight. Sif brought water with fingers that shook. Bragi began humming under his breath, a sound that turns pain into something the air can carry without dropping. Loki didn't move. He watched his son tremble with the insult of magic and the blunt conclusion of betrayal. He watched his friend, if that's the word for the bond you build with someone you keep hurting, bleed the price of everyone else's relief. He stood there with his face made of nothing and everything. For one long draught of time, he looked like a man inventorying debts. Fenrir tested the ribbon again and again, each try smaller, not because he was giving up, but because he was learning the shape of the new room he'd been left in. He tried to keep his dignity in his body the way dogs do, arranging his paws just so, lifting his head just so. The ribbon glittered faintly in the sun, something a child might have braided in a happier story. They dragged him. It took all of them. He dug furrows that filled with the kind of water you don't want to call tears. They found an island and pinned the ribbon's ends to rocks that had listened to older suffering. They shoved a sword into his mouth as a prop so he could not close it, the blade standing upright like an insult, like a husband who refuses to sit. His jaws foamed and the foam ran like a river that had given up pretending to be clear. It pooled in a lake, and the lake got a name, and whoever told that name first did not laugh. When it was done, the gods stood around, breathing the way people breathe after fights they won and didn't like. Tyr's sleeve was nothing now. Sif's hands were red. Thor had blood spattered across one cheek like someone had tried to paint a new constellation on him, and stopped halfway through. Odin looked like a man who had broken his own rule and gotten exactly what he ordered. Fenrir stared at them over the sword, and if eyes could cut, the Yard would have been ribbons too. He looked at Loki last. The look said, "You did not bite me, but you did not stop them either." Loki's mouth opened. Nothing worthy came out. He did something small instead. He stepped closer than anyone else dared, and set his hand, his whole, unbitten hand, against the fur between Fenrir's eyes. The wolf blinked slow. His breath warmed Loki's wrist. For a beat you could imagine a version of the story that ended differently. Then it was gone. Back in the hall, people talked in low voices as if the walls were asleep. Tyr sat while a healer set to work. The pain smashed through and receded, smashed through again. That tide that doesn't consult anyone. He was quiet through most of it, and then not, because no one is. When it was over, he held the stump the way men hold new things they didn't ask for and didn't order, and now will spend the rest of their days learning. Loki brought him mead, and the kind of silence that allows a man to keep his dignity. "You feed him still," Tyr said, not looking up. "I would," Loki said, "if they would let me near." Night draped itself over the eaves, and the stars did their work without checking in. Odin went again to the terrace. He heard the distant new rush of the river that had been a wolf's mouth. He spoke aloud, not because he needed the sound, but because sometimes you say things so the air will remember them if you forget. It buys us time, he told the dark. It does not buy us mercy. In the corner, a boy who'd grown up inside the stories cleaned a bloodstain off the floor with sand and a rag and learned by muscle what adults try to teach with words, that keeping the world together costs pieces of you that don't grow back the same shape, and under the weight of mountains that had forgotten their names. The serpent shifted, amused, patient, far below roots that have never not been thirsty. Hell counted new arrivals with the grace of a clerk and the eyes of a queen. On an island that used to mean nothing, a wolf tested a ribbon again and felt something inside him go very quiet and very sharp. Oaths held that night the way ice holds when the moon is thin and the wind is gentle. You can walk on that kind of ice if you step soft. You cannot live there. Asgard slept badly. Dreams came with teeth and faded with the taste of iron. Those who loved Loki found him changed by inches, a man who had been measured by his own children and found both bigger and smaller than he wanted to be. Those who feared prophecy slept with their hands open under blankets, as if they were about to catch something falling. Tyr woke 3 times with his phantom hand aching like memory. Each time he sat up and breathed like a soldier who knows counting helps, then lay down again, not because it was easier, but because it was necessary. By morning, the yard looked the same. The sky was the same sky that had watched a veil turn into a battle and a ribbon turn into a prison. Birds tested the air the way you test a stranger's handshake. Someone put bread on a table. Someone else laughed a bright, small laugh and then apologized for it as if joy was something you needed permission to use. Word reached the outer farms there is a wolf on an island who once ate from a god's hand and now eats only anger. Word reached further still there is a serpent that can hug the world and will, if you let it. Word went everywhere the dead go, the girl at the end of the road is fair and terrible and she will look you in the eye when she tells you the truth, and afterward you will be both better and worse. This is how a world tightens, invisibly, day by day. A decision here, an oath there, a chain that looks like ribbon, a laugh that sounds like mercy until you remember the price. The gods did not speak of the island at breakfast. They did not have to. It had climbed into the way they held their cups, into the pitch of their voices, into the numbers they chose for plans. You could smell it in the hall the way you smell a storm over the ridge. Loki went walking, not to fix anything, just to keep from breaking something he could not replace. He walked past the yard where the games had used to be easy. He walked to the edge of the wall he had once helped build by accident, by shame, by cleverness. He laid his hand on the stone. It was cold. It would be warm later, when the sun came around. For a moment, he closed his eyes and pretended he could feel it warming already. Then he opened them. He was not stupid. He was trying to see if hope would let him cheat. From far off, that same metal-singing wolf sound came, less song than warning. It braided with the wind and got into everything. Even the quiet people heard it. Even the sleepy ones shifted. The day carried on, as days do when they don't know they're famous yet. Men and women in Midgard fed fires and told bedtime stories that made their children smile and made their old ones look toward the door. They told the one about the god in a dress and the hammer in a lap and laughed, because that one is a relief. They began learning the new one about the beautiful monster who bit down because he was asked to trust, and no one told him when to stop. And under everything, the ribbon held. It would hold until the day it didn't. The gods did not say that part out loud. Saying a thing like that is like teaching your house how to listen for fire. Better to sleep the way exhausted people sleep honestly, with your mouth open, assuming the roof will be there when you wake. The morning after the island, change came in small, domestic ways, the kind people pretend not to notice because noticing means admitting the world has moved again. Salt wind rolled in from the west and slid like a cool hand across Asgard's courtyards. The ovens woke. Someone beat rugs. Someone else tuned a harp and stopped when a string gave that brittle little cry that means it's time to replace it. The gods, hunched over bread and thought, did their best to act like routine could keep fate in its chair. Down by the quays, a low fog held the ships as if the water had decided to remember its manners. That's where Njord belonged, at the seam where wood meets wave, where rope hisses and gulls complain, where the air tastes like iron and clean rot. He was a Vanir god, not Isir, but the truce had sewn him here, and he wore the stitch without fuss. He knew wind the way we know our own temper, its moods, its tells, the rare days it lies. Skadi came from the opposite page of the book, mountain bred, step as sure as a nail through oak, hunter's calm, hunter's hunger. She had walked into Asgard once with snow still hanging in the fur at her shoulders, bow in her hand, grief in her mouth. Her father, the giant Thiazi, had died angry. Skadi had come to collect interest. The settlement was strange, even by god standards, laughter to ease her sorrow, a promise of a husband chosen by his feet alone. And in the end, the marriage that looked like a bridge no one checked for weight limits. They made a go of it. That's the honest story, and they tried. At first, it was even sweet. Skadi picked a Njord because his feet were beautiful sea god feet, clean and pale, strong with little scars like punctuation. In the hall, they fit together in the way opposites do when the novelty is still louder than the friction. She smelled like smoke and pine resin. He smelled like salt and crushed shells. They took turns 9 nights by the shore, 9 nights in the mountains because love says yes to compromises that common sense would set on fire. At Noatun, his home, mornings came easy. Fog lifted off the water like a blessing that had learned how to be brief. Nets steamed on racks. Njord's laughter ran along the docks, a long bright sound with room in it. He'd show Skadi the quick green flicker in a shallow where fish turn, the way a good tide feels under your boots, the trick of reading glassy water for what it's hiding. She listened, half smiling, and tried to love the sea the way he loved it. But at night the gulls never shut up, not even for a minute, and the house creaked the way boats do, complaining in little wooden voices, and the smell of tar and kelp settled in the bedclothes like a guest who doesn't understand leaving. Skadi slept with her shoulders tight and her jaw holding back a growl. "In the 9th dawn there," she said. "My turn." They packed, kissed like people reassuring themselves they're good at kissing, and climbed into the spine of the world. At Thrymheim, her hall, snow spoke. It speaks softly when it falls. It screams when it slides. The wind has ways of telling you what it thinks of your plans, and up there, it thinks most plans are funny. Skadi glowed in it. She moved across ice like a pen across paper, Skis whispered. A fox flashed red and vanished as if it had been a thought that got embarrassed. She taught Njord to read tracks, to hear the difference between old ice and new, to know when to trust the sky and when to get small under a ledge and wait. He tried. He really did. But at night the wolves sang too close, and the house answered like a drum, and the mountains lay against the windows like large truths nobody had asked for. Njord lay awake and counted breaths, mistakes, the ways he did not belong here. On the 9th dawn there, he said, "My turn." And when they met at the door, their smiles were already a little tired. That is how you can love someone and still measure your life in 9 night apologies. They lasted as long as goodwill lasts, which is to say, right up until goodwill realised it had been given 2 jobs and only got paid for 1. They parted with dignity, no screaming, no plates. Skadi went back to her mountains and her bright, precise joy. Njord returned to the tide that never forgets anything, not even the name you rarely use. People will call it a failed marriage. That's a simple word for something complicated and decent. Sometimes 2 good places don't share a climate. Freya watched all this with the soft, fearless attention she brought to almost everything. Brisingamen lay at her throat like a private son. She belonged to both camps in ways that confused men who like charts Werner by blood, Essa by treaty, battle bright and bedwise, tender and terrifying. Half the fallen came to her field, Folkvanger, instead of Odin's loud hall, and the ones who did always looked surprised that death could taste like rest. On hard nights, Freya would stroke a warrior's hair off his forehead and say, "There, there," and the world would pretend it had time to be kind. Her brother Freya was built of a different brightness, the kind that comes up over a field and makes everyone remember seeds. He loved simple things, deeply good weather, good harvests, the way ships snug into harbours like exhale, the way a woman's laugh changes a room's temperature. He could pull sun into a bad season and lay it over crops like a blanket. People lit fires for him when they needed grace disguised as luck. One day, grace lost its disguise. Freya climbed Odin's high seat when the old god was away, because curiosity is a kind of hunger, and hunger doesn't ask permission. From that seat, you can look everywhere. He let his gaze wander like a bored god zoning out in class until it stopped, in Jotunheim, among iron-dark trees. A woman walked into a clearing and turned the light into a job. Her name was Gerda. Her hair held the colour of ripe wheat that a storm had decided to spare. She carried winter and summer in the set of her mouth. Freya leaned forward the way men lean when they forget how to sit like they're not falling. He came down from the seat with his chest newly empty and newly full. He tried to work. He tried to sleep. He tried to be who he'd been yesterday. It didn't take. He stopped eating. Even his boar, Gullinbursti, pawed the floor and looked at him with worried gold bristles. Love, when it actually happens, looks a lot less like songs and a lot more like a man who can't remember where he put his hands. Skirner, his servant and friend, watched long enough to be sure this wasn't something a walk would fix. He said the thing you say when a friend is drowning and you own a rope. Tell me what you saw. Freya tried not to say her name because names are spells. And once you set one down in the air, it starts working on the room. He failed. Gerda, he said. The syllables came out like a prayer a farmer would say when the clouds finally open. She stands like the part of spring where you can still see the snow, but it's losing. Where Skirnir asked, Freya told him. Skirnir nodded, sharp and practical. then did what love always demands of someone nearby. He volunteered for a dangerous errand. Freyr's eyes softened. "Take my horse," he said. "He can run through dark as if it were only thinner light." He paused, fingers worrying the edge of a table. "And take this." He handed Skirnir a sword. It sang when it left its sheath. Some weapons behave, some wake up. This one woke. Skirnir doubled his grip. "You'd send me armed and go unarmed." Freyr smiled a little, the way proud men do when they're proving they're not men but metaphors. What good is a god if he can't give away what he needs and still bring back what he loves? Skirnir did not argue, because there are times when arguing only teaches fate your voice. He mounted. The horse took the shadow road at a smooth lope. Forests unrolled under him like rugs. The air cooled, then cooled again, until breath became a visible thing that needed its own name. He passed the hut of a man whose job it was to stare at horizons and report on nothing. He passed a river that had misremembered its banks and was waiting for an argument. He arrived at a fence of simple stakes, each topped with a human skull whose mouths laughed in the fixed way dead mouths do. Inside. Gerda stood in her yard and watched the kind of dusk that means the light can't decide who it belongs to. Skirnir approached with his palms visible. "I bring words from someone who has been quieter the last 3 days than he's been in a century," he said. "He will bring you orchards and peace and the long, soft rains that come without thunder. He will fill your barns and hush your fears. He will build you a hall where your footsteps sound like certainty." Gerda listened. She had grown up where promises often arrive on the end of a spear. She kept her hands by her sides, and her face did not move much. "And if I say no, then I go home," Skirnir said honestly. "And he goes on not eating." She looked at the horse. It chewed like a polite guest who knows exactly how much he's taking. She looked at Skirnir's hands. He wasn't lying. She knew what lies look like. They make little ripples in the air around a person's mouth. But there was more in the yard than two careful people. There were shadows that didn't belong to anything you could see. Skirnir felt them too. He sighed, which in another life might have been a prayer, and drew the sword. Power changed the temperature. He raised a carved wand, gamantine, the kind of stick that only looks like a stick until someone who knows how points it. He spoke runes, not cruelly but not kindly either. The air tilted. He called down curses the way a storm calls down decisions. If you refuse the good, you might wake up with the bad. He named loneliness. He named thirst. He named a hunger that curls you up and keeps you that way. He named a hill far from company with a view of everything you cannot touch. Gerda's eyes narrowed. She was not a coward, but bravery isn't the same as stubbornness. And she heard in his threat the rhythms of something older than his voice. Also, this matters. She wanted to say yes, not because she was afraid. Because she had seen more winters than she liked of men with nothing to love except how cold they could be. "Enough," she said. "Tell him to come in 9 nights. I will meet him in the grove, Barry. Tell him to bring patience and leave his thunder at home." Skirnir dropped his shoulders like a man setting down a heavy bucket that had been biting his hand. The shadow press eased. He sheathed the sword, and the blade made that pleased little sound steel makes when it gets to relax. He rode home by the same quick dark road, and the dark seemed friendlier, the way it does when you have permission. Freyr heard the news and smiled in a way that wrung noises out of the people in the room who had been worried enough to pretend they weren't. He tried very hard to wait like a god. He failed in all the regular human ways. He counted nights with an impatience big enough to make doors creak. On the 7th evening he went down to the shore and stood ankle deep where the water hits you and says, "Still here." On the 8th he walked fields with his hand open, and the barley rose up to touch it like a blessing rehearsing itself. On the 9th he went to Barry. The grove smelled like green thinks it's a secret. Birch and something sweeter tangled. He stood with his back to a tree and listened to his heart try to outrun itself. She came as evening was starting to remember stars. They looked at each other the way people do when they have already chosen and are just waiting for their mouths to catch up. No thunder, no threats. They touched simply, cleanly, like two lines that had always meant to cross here. They spoke. And the words didn't matter in the way words don't matter when the body has already said a thing with better grammar. They promised the kind of things people promise when they mean it. Not everything forever, but everything they can hold. It was soft. It was brave. It was exactly what Freyr had seen from the high seat, only closer, which is better and worse. They married as people do who trust the season they're standing in. Here is the part the bards carve smaller. Until it fits on a line, he'd given away his sword. At first, it didn't feel like a cost. Fields rounded up into abundance. Children ran with bread in their hands and ate without looking over their shoulders. Ships came home on time. People said Freya's name with the unself-conscious gratitude of breath. He walked through his good weather and felt full. But tools are stories, and some stories do not forget you. A rumour began to sit in corners, the fire in the south sharpening itself. A shape with a sword made of tragedy, a man who used to own a blade that could have bent that fire backward. Odin heard it and kept his face polite. Thor heard it and swung the hammer a few extra times at practice, just to hear how certainty sounds. Freya heard it and rested her hand on Freya's arm the way a sister says, "I'm here even when here is a place no one can stand for you." Skadi caught the rumour on the mountain winds and nodded once to herself, not unkind. Njord heard it at the edge of the quay and looked at the sea the way old sailors look at a storm they'll try to talk out of its worst ideas. Freya did not take his worry to the hall. He took it to the grove. He's not the first man to tell his fears to trees. He asked the leaves if love could be both the best thing he'd ever done and a debt with a due date. The leaves did that leaf thing where they refused to be more or less than beautiful. He came home lighter anyway. Sometimes talking is a kind of payment that buys you time. Gerda did not pretend she hadn't heard. She walked the border of her land and learned its moods like you learn the moods of a new house which steps complain, which doors stick, which windows lie. She killed a boar and salted it and said winter is not impressed by sentiment. Bring wood. She sat with Freya at the hearth and listened to him be human in the way gods hate being. She kissed him and said, "We live inside circles. Let's draw as many as we can before one closes. If you want a moral simple enough to stitch on a banner, here's a bad one, never give away the sword you'll need later. If you want the truth, here's what the North taught everything that grows does so because something else was given up. Grain rises out of buried seed. Families rise out of vows that cost something to keep. Peace rises out of pride someone decided not to spend today. Freya's fields were proof. They were also a receipt. Time went on. That's the cruelest magic. Children who had heard the story of the god in the dress grew up into men who swung axes and women who laughed at bad weather. They planted in spring and reaped in fall and told each other with good humour that Freya had lost his sword for love. And maybe that's why the barley loved them back. In winter, by firelight, someone would say, "Do you ever think about what happens when the big fire comes north?" And someone else would say, "Hush, because you don't tell your house about lightning." Freya's field filled and emptied and filled again. She wrote letters to grief in a hand that made even grief sit up straighter. Skadi traced wolf prints across slopes and looked toward the far south without letting her face tell on her. Njord sang to the ropes and watched storms shift their shoulders. Odin stood on his terrace and practiced not blinking. One evening, when the light went long and gold and hopeful in that cheap way it does, Freya found his sister on a low wall, feet swinging. "If I asked you whether I did the right thing, what would you say?" he asked. Freya smiled a little, which is different from smiling a lot. "I'd say you did the only thing that would let you be you in the way that matters. And if the bill comes due," he asked. "It always does," she said, "but we're not at the table yet." She tipped her head. "Eat while the food is hot," he laughed, breath loosening. "You make even doom sound domestic." "It is," she said. "We die in kitchens as often as on fields. We say goodbye in doorways more than on walls." She slid off the stones and bumped her shoulder into him like they were children. "Go home. Bring Gerda flowers you picked yourself. Gods forget how hands work." He did. He brought an armful of something bright and careless and set it in a jug, and Gerda pretended not to see his ears go a little red. They ate bread that had learned how to be crust, and they slept the way people sleep who know the night is doing math they can't stop. Under the sea, the serpent shifted its weight the way continents do when they remember something. In Hel's Hall, the queen walked the aisles and kept her ledger in the neatest hand. On the island, the wolf dreamed sideways with the sword between his teeth and woke with a sound that got into the mortar of Asgard and made hair lift on the arms of men half a world away. In Muspelheim, a shadow leaned on a blade that had no right to be as hot as it was and smiled without humour. And in a grove that loved lovers, a god without a sword held the hand of the woman who had taught him what his power was for, and he let the quiet work. He listened to her breathe. He remembered that all fields start as silence. He decided, and this is the only decision that ever counts, to be fully present for the golden, ridiculous mercy of now. Tomorrow would keep, tomorrow always does, until it doesn't. The year softened at the edges. Fields did their gentle miracle, the kind that looks ordinary until you try living without it. In the halls, people laughed again like the sound had been sharpened and now cut cleaner. But under that good noise, a restless question kept turning over what keeps a story alive when winter leans in. It wasn't swords, it wasn't even hammers, it was words. The right ones. The ones that stitch a community together on nights when the wind insults the bones. The best words used to belong to one person. He was called Kvaizir, born the day God spat peace into a bowl and refused to call the taste what it was. From truce they shaped a man, and in him every question found its answer walking toward it with a lamp. He wandered the 9 realms with the calm of someone who knows his work will never be done and still shows up on time. He did not hoard knowing, he gave it away like bread. Men left his presence with their shoulders lowered and their eyes up, the way you stand when hope has weight again. You can measure a culture by what it does to its teachers. 2 dwarves, Fiala and Gala, watched Kvasir pour fine language into rough lives, and felt that borderless admiration that flips, hard and fast, into envy. Envy is love's shadow, it knows all your roots. They invited him in, fed him politely, listened with bright eyes, and when the room agreed to be quiet, they slit his throat and let the truth run out. They caught it in a pot and stirred honey into it until the air itself seemed drunk. They named the brew with names pretty and precise: Odraria, Bodden, Son, the way guilty men name things to keep from naming the act. Kvasir's body, they told people, had died because he knew too much and had no questions left. It was tidy. It was almost funny. People nodded because good stories bruise easier than bad facts. The mead did not just make poetry. It made poetry the way storms make rivers suddenly. Everywhere. With force you can't stand still in. Drinking it turned strong men articulate and cowards brave enough to tell the truth exactly once. It made love letters sound like bridges you could walk your whole family across. It turned funeral words into blankets. Even lies tasted better if the liar had wet his mouth at the right bowl. Fiala and Gala weren't done. People who get away with one thing tend to try for another. They hosted a giant named Gilling and took him out in a boat. For air. They tipped the boat and watched him drown, then rolled home and told his wife with looks of careful sadness. When she cried too loudly, they dropped a millstone on her head from a doorway. That's how you know envy is a coward, it prefers a balcony. But news grows teeth. Gilling's son, Suttung, followed the blood through the grass and into the dwarves' hall. He lifted them by their shirts out of their tricks. He carried them to the shore where the tide never gets tired and set them on a skerry that the sea mispronounces all day. He let the water rise to their shins, then their waists, then their chins. They confessed quickly, as men do when they remember how short a neck really is. They told him about the mead, about the dead man whose voice had been turned into a drink. Suttung spared them to the extent that survival counts as mercy, and took the mead away like a father taking the keys from children who'd borrowed them without permission. He hid it inside a mountain called Hernitbjorg, behind a door that didn't mind being a rumour. He put his daughter Gunnlod in the chamber with the vats and told her to guard it with her life, which is the kind of order that ruins both. Word has legs. It ran uphill to the terrace where Odin performs the daily ritual of pretending he doesn't miss blinking. He heard about the mead and the locked door, and the woman set between them like a hinge. He listened to Mimir's quiet mouth say what he already knew, that inspiration had been stolen twice once from a living man. Again from the people who needed what he gave, and that the world would start to die at the edges if this wasn't corrected. Odin did not call a council. He did not tell Thor to fetch anything. He put on an old man's coat and a name that fit like dusk. On the road, he found a man in a field arguing with a scythe that would not cut. The grass leaned in, unbothered. Odin took the whetstone from his belt and kissed it on the scythe's edge until the metal remembered how to sing. The man's eyes went big with summer. "Sell me that stone," he said. Odin tossed it into the crowd that had arrived as if the road had grown hands, and men tripped over one another, fighting for the chance to sharpen their days. In the scramble, Odin walked away smiling, because sometimes inspiration works best when no one knows where it came from. He went to Suttung's brother, Baugi, whose name means something like ring, and whose life had become exactly that circles of work around the same centre. Baugi's men had died in a harvest accident. His fields looked up with the flat, disappointed faces of mouths that had not been fed. Odin called himself Bölverk Evil Deed, because names are helmets and also jokes, and offered to harvest the whole summer for him if, at the end, Bogi would help him get one swallow of the mead. A fair trade, if your arithmetic only counts days. Odin worked like a man hiding from himself, which is to say beautifully. He cut and bound and lifted and stacked. He made labour look like the thing it actually is when you do it with your whole body worship the world accepts as payment. The fields lay down satisfied. Baugi kept his promise the way a tired man keeps a promise to a magician who solved his hunger. They walked to Nitbjorg. Suttung refused them just as politely as a door refuses weather. Then a hole, Odin said softly, and pulled from his coat a drill called Rati. He gave it to Baugi. Bore, he told him, and Baugi bored, and the mountain coughed dust like an old smoker told a joke. Is it through? Odin asked. Through. Baugi lied, because even decent men resent the moment they realize they were the preface to someone else's story. Odin blew into the hole, rock dust blew back. He smiled without kindness. Baugi drilled again. This time, when Odin breathed, the mountain breathed too. He shifted shape the way a word shifts meaning in the right mouth. He became a snake, a length of muscle with intention, and slid into the bored dark. Bogi stabbed at the hole and hit only the memory of him. Inside was cold the way secret places are. He wound deeper until the hole opened into a chamber that had been a woman's entire horizon for longer than happiness can stand. Gunnlod sat among the vats the way a priestess sits among altars, careful, a little bored, dangerous to underestimate. She looked up at the snake that became a man. Odin let his old name slide off his shoulders and stood there with the kind of handsomeness that has collected too many stories to be safe. "Who are you?" she asked. And he said the kind of name that means someone who is about to ask you to make a ruin of your father's instructions. He did not go straight for the mead. He went for the truth she lived with. He asked how long she had sat here, what the mountain sounded like in winter, whether the vats ever talked to her in sleep. He asked what she missed. People in cages will tell you all their favourite kinds of weather. He listened like a river listens deeply, as if something might fall in that he could carry far. He held her gaze without hunting it. He made himself soft where she was sharp and sharp where she was soft. He asked politely to stay one night to keep the cold from thinking it had won. One night became 3. They did not argue fate. They ignored it with the kind of devotion that makes fate jealous. He folded her into his arms where the mountain couldn't see it. He spoke to the parts of her that her duty had not killed, the pieces that still remembered grass, laughter, the ordinary sin of mornings that don't start with keys turning. He did not promise. He offered. There is a difference, and she was old enough to know it, and she said yes anyway, because yes is the most human word. On the 3rd night, she took him to the mead. She gave him a drink, the first, and he tilted the bowl and did not stop until it was air. The 2nd vat came, and the same miracle the way a star disappears into daylight. Everything gone. The 3rd followed, and he wiped the chamber dry of poetry as if he were erasing a debt. He changed again, feathers now, lengthening, shoulder blades breaking open into the confident ache of wings. He rose in the chamber with the spin of someone who has never believed in gravity as anything but a rumour with bad manners. He flew. Suttung heard the mountain call out and took eagle shape because old men have backups. The sky's an honest place to fight, nowhere to hide. Only speed, angle, will. They shot through the morning like 2 arguments with the same end. Odin's throat burned with honey and power and the kind of fear you only feel when you're carrying something you can't drop. Asgard's walls grew out of the horizon with their familiar, beloved arrogance. The gods saw the shape and knew the risk and did what people do for someone they love who's coming in too hot. They made the landing more likely. They rolled out vats and troughs, the big ones, the kind you use when you expect to feed an army. Odin cleared the wall and let go. The mead poured from his beak into the tubs in a long, golden line that smelled like every good speech you've ever heard. A few drops fell short onto the courtyard, stone splatters caught by men who write endings that don't deserve them, by courtiers and clout chasers and anyone who thinks a metaphor is a necklace and not a tool. Let them have it. The real stuff flowed clean for those who would use it like bread, like blankets, like the glue for a community trying to stay itself between winters. Suttung skidded to the wall's edge and fell back into himself, feather by feather, rage lighting him and then leaving like a storm that decides on another town. He shouted oaths not even the ravens bothered to remember. Gunnlod's name hung in the air like frost, and the story does something cheap here. Usually, it forgets her. It pretends she was only a door he found a way through. But men who go into mountains to steal songs should count costs out loud. Gunnlod bent over the dry vats and understood she had been loved and used in the same week by the same mouth. She sat very still and let the pain identify itself, because naming is one of the only magics that works on grief. After a while, she stood. She touched the rims of the empty vessels with a hand that forgives slower than priests and truer than kings. She walked out of the chamber and into her life, which had changed, which would keep changing with or without anyone's permission. In Asgard, poets drank and felt their tongues wake like muscles coming back from numbness. Farmers found words for weather that made their children pay attention. Warriors buried their dead with sentences that set the bones down gentle. Mothers spoke to infants in cadences so true the babies pretended to sleep just to keep hearing them. Hymns grew like moss, jokes sharpened, gossip got worse, naturally. Odin watched with the contentment of a thief who believes the thing stolen was rightfully his to begin with. He said nothing public about the woman in the mountain. He said a great many private things to himself he would never admit. That night, the hall breathed the way houses do when the day has been exciting enough to exhaust even the beams. Bragi sang with his voice newly rinsed. Freya smiled a little, the way you do when a project you never put your name on finally works. Tyr sipped, cradling his sleeve with the gentleness he had learned the hard way. Thor laughed until the laugh became a yawn, and then a satisfied silence. Loki listened, eyes half-lidded, measuring the shape of a world where words had been returned to people who might use them against him, or for him, or both, in the same afternoon. Odin stood at the threshold and tasted the air where the mead's sweetness was thinning into the normal smells of wood smoke, leather, sleep. He thought about Kvasir, whose knowledge had been a public utility until it became a commodity. He thought about Fjallar and Galar, whose cleverness could make a marvel out of a murder. He thought about Suttung, who had been good at keeping and bad at sharing. He thought about Gunnlod, whose yes had saved a world and complicated a smaller one. He thought about his own hands, which had kept the promise he made to nobody out loud to bring back the thing that keeps people human when weather gets mean. He did not apologize. He did not pray. He closed his eye and breathed in and out the way a man does who knows tomorrow will want something new. Somewhere below, in the deep where roots drink secrets and do not tell, hell counted souls with a patience not even poetry can soften. Far out, the serpent rolled and felt, maybe for the first time, that the songs above the water were getting better. On his island, the wolf slept and woke and slept and dreamed of hands he had trusted and of ribbons that felt like lies that forgot their lines. In a warm house in Midgard, a mother told a bedtime story without stumbling, and the child's breathing slowed like a tide. This is what the mead purchased, not glory, not fame, comprehension, courage that fits in the mouth. The night held. The mead held. The words found people who could carry them, and the people carried each other across another cold hour without breaking. That's civilization in the north, not palaces, not laws, but sentences that make the dark less sure of itself. The sky was too clear that morning, the kind of clear that makes even gods shift in their chairs. Nothing hides in a sky like that. Balder rose with the sun and stretched as if the world were weightless. He was the one they all loved, the god of light. Not just daylight, but the warmth that makes life feel worth the effort. His presence eased tempers, softened grief, steadied trembling hands. When Balder walked into a hall, voices lifted without meaning to, even Odin's eye seemed less heavy when it rested on him. But perfection is a challenge the universe rarely lets stand for long. Night after night, Balder began waking from dreams full of black water and burning sky. Dreams where he walked through halls that had no doors back out. His face turned pale, his laugh slower. He told no one at first, because golden men are taught to hide their cracks, but mothers know. Frigg watched her son's smile thinning and felt the breath catch in her chest. She went out into the wide world like only a desperate mother can. She sought oaths from everything that could hurt him. Fire swore it would not burn, water swore it would not drown, stones, trees, metals, beasts, diseases each promised, with her hand at their throat, that they would not harm Balder. The world signed its name on a treaty with her grief. When she returned, she believed he was safe. The gods tested it. At feasts they tossed stones at him, laughing when they bounced like toys. Spears shattered. Blades glanced off as if they'd been carved from sugar. Even Thor's hammer veered aside with a groan of confusion. Balder stood there with that patient, radiant smile, and for a time, Asgard forgot fear. Not everyone laughed. Loki watched from the shadows, sharp-eyed, his lips pinched thin. To him, love that pure was an insult, a reminder of what he would never be. Envy took his hand like an old friend. He walked among the roots of Yggdrasil until he found something Frigg had overlooked. The mistletoe small, pale, too weak for her to demand a vow from. She had passed it by, thinking it harmless. Loki plucked it and felt destiny coil around his fingers like smoke. He shaped it into a dart, light and cruel. Then he went to Herda, Balder's blind brother, who sat apart at the games, hearing the laughter but not joining in. Loki placed the dart in his hand and said, "Why should you miss the joy throw, as the others do? Aim at him, your brother cannot be harmed." Herda's face lit with a brief, grateful glow. He drew back and cast. The mistletoe flew straight, as if it had been waiting for this path since the first winter. It pierced Balder clean through. The hall rang with a sound that no feast should ever carry the gasp of disbelief when joy is murdered. Balder fell, not with rage, not with fear, but with a softness that made the silence worse. His blood looked wrong in that bright place. Frigg's cry broke the rafters. Odin closed his eye and saw all his waiting fears crowding into the present. The gods stood stunned until the horror tipped them into fury. Herda stumbled, reaching, but his hands were empty of both dart and brother. Loki slipped out with a smile that cut its own throat. They buried Balder with treasures enough for 100 kings. Nanna, his wife, collapsed beside him, and her heart broke so completely it carried her after him. They laid her on the pyre with him, the two of them twined as if even death couldn't teach them separation. His ship, Hringhorni, was the greatest ever built, but too heavy to budge. They called for a giantess from Jotunheim Hyrrokin who came riding a wolf with snakes for reins. She shoved the prow, and the ship skidded into the water like a wound opening. The pyre blazed, smoke carrying light away from the world that needed it. Odin bent over the flames and whispered a secret into his dead son's ear. No one ever learned what it was. Maybe a promise. Maybe an apology. Maybe just the name of the fear that would end them all. Then he placed Draupnir, his golden ring, on Balder's chest, as if wealth could sweeten the grave. But death, in Norse lands, was not a locked gate. Frigg begged for a messenger to ride to Hel's hall and ask for Balder back. Her mother, Odin's other son, took Sleipnir and galloped down the long dark road that bends time. 9 nights he rode, over valleys so deep you couldn't hear your own thoughts, across rivers that whispered names not meant for the living. At last he reached Hel's hall. There sat Balder, pale but unharmed, his beauty dimmed but not erased. He embraced his brother and spoke softly. "Tell them I live here now. Tell them I am not in pain. But tell them also I miss the sun. Hel, a half woman and half corpse. Listen to the plea. She made an offer. If everything in the world wept for Balder, she would release him. If anything refused, he would stay." Hermoda raced back with hope in his mouth. The gods sent messengers across the 9 realms. Trees dripped tears. Stones grew slick. Beasts howled. Men and women wept. Even the metals shuddered, remembering warmth. The world bent itself into grief. But in a cave, an old giantess named Thok sat dry-eyed. When asked, she said coldly, "Let Hel hold what she has." Some say it was Loki in another skin, whoever it was. The refusal sealed the bargain. Balder would not return until after the last battle, when a new world rose. Hope turned into rage. Vali, Odin's youngest son, barely a day old, grew into a man in an hour and killed Herda with a single strike. The gods had their vengeance, but vengeance is a poor blanket. The hall felt empty without Balder's laugh. The air felt older. Odin walked heavier, and Loki, his smile had curdled into something dangerous. He mocked the gods at feasts, spitting venom disguised as jokes. He told Freya truths no one wanted in their cups. He jeered at Odin's bargains, at Tyr's empty sleeve, at Sif's bed, he stood, bold and drunk, until Thor's hammer shook the rafters. Even then, he laughed. But laughter cannot outpace consequence forever. The gods seized him at last. He ran, changing shape into fish, into falcon, into things that do not belong in stories, but they caught him, dragged him back, and bound him beneath the earth with the guts of his own son. Above his face they hung a serpent, dripping venom. His wife Sigyn stayed, catching the drops in a bowl, emptying it again and again. But when she moved to spill it, venom struck his skin, and Loki writhed so violently the earth itself quaked. That was why earthquakes came, they said, because even punishment shakes the world. So the light was lost, bound in Hell's Hall. The trickster was chained in the dark, his laughter turned to screams, and the gods sat above in Asgard, drinking mead that suddenly tasted thinner, waiting without saying so for the next crack in the walls,